This is Emily Blackshear with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the Oklahoma State University Library. Today is Wednesday, July 7th, 2021, and I'm interviewing Hank Jones for the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Oral History Project. Hank, you're a professor at Tarleton State University, a graduate of the Red Earth MFA program, and recently published a collection of poetry, Too Late for Manly Hands, with Turning Plow Press. I can say that. Thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's start by learning a little about you. Could you tell me where you were born and where you grew up?
So my father was in the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Bliss Military Base in El Paso. And so I was born at the Beaumont Military Hospital there in El Paso in 1969, and then spent the rest of my kind of childhood and youth moving around with my parents as we were stationed mostly in the United States, but we also spent some time in Germany, two times in Germany, but I was a little kid, so I don't remember that very well. And then my dad's last tour of duty was in Japan, in Tokyo, Japan. He was worked with the military attaché office at the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Japan. And in between, we lived in Fort Bliss, El Paso a couple of times, Las Cruces, New Mexico, Cavalier, North Dakota, Monterey, California, a couple of times, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So I was moved around a lot, and one of the things of being a military brat, which what they call us, is I don't really have a sense of a hometown. I didn't really have one place that I grew up in or have friends to return to, sort of thing. So I kind of just lived a nomadic life since then, I guess. Just kind of moved around and. It's the good part is I can kind of pick up and move anywhere and kind of make myself feel at home. But the downside is there's not a place I feel like I can return to where I've got old friends to remind me of the old days.
Yeah.
So
how do you ground yourself in that? Like, how do you feel rooted in a place when you don't really have a place to claim?
I think in my case, it's where my parents are from. So my dad was from Glen Rose, Texas. And so mostly every year we would return to Glen Rose and we would see his parents and his brothers and sisters and all their children. And so that was a kind of a yearly thing. And then my mother's family is from New Mexico, and sort of the same thing. We would return to New Mexico and spend time with them. And so those are sort of the two places. The ranch in New Mexico it's between Carrizozo and Socorro, New Mexico, kind of right in the heart of New Mexico. And so I feel sort of a connection there, and I feel a connection to Glen Rose, Texas, which is southwest of Fort Worth. And those are kind of the two places I always return to with my family. And so that's sort of, that feels like as close to home as I've got a feeling for. So
yeah,
that helps.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll go back to talking about your parents and grandparents, maybe your family background in just a second. But you teach at a university in Texas, but then you also live in Oklahoma. So you've got
exactly.
Yeah, so you've got a view of both places. Do you think Oklahoma feels a little bit? I don't want to say, does Oklahoma feel like home? I'm trying not to say that, but
right.
I guess I just did.
and I was thinking about that, prior to the interview. And I think it's beginning to, we've been here, my wife and I have been here for 3 years. And it's beginning to feel that way, but I think it's going to take a little bit longer. Partly I don't have a lot of family. My aunt, who provided the house that we're living in off of Keystone Lake, she's here. And so I have that connection. But otherwise, most of my family is still back in Texas and New Mexico. And I think it's going to take a while before I feel like I know Oklahoma well. I'm going to have to, work the land and, some sweat and some blood in the soil to really feel like I'm starting to know the place, to know the trees and the birds and the animals, and to we saw some giant spiders on our deck this morning.
Oh no.
Julie and I have no idea what they are, so I don't feel like I'm an Oklahoman yet because I see giant creatures. And I'm like, I don't know what that is yet, so but I'm learning, everything I see, I take notes and I try to get to know it a little bit better. And I do think I have so many friends here. That's why we came to Oklahoma, was the poetry scene.
Mm-hmm.
Scissortail Creative Writing Festival, high among them. With Ken Hayda has got this wonderful writing festival that we started coming to, I think 2013. We were still living in Texas, and through Scissortail, we just sort of met everybody. All the friends we have today sort of are all connected to Scissortail some way, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just such a vibrant, lovely community of people. And so when the opportunity came to move up here, we thought we would be very happy to be part of Oklahoma. But yeah, it doesn't feel like home yet. I know that it will, and I think we're
Mm-hmm.
committed to the long haul.
Yeah.
But yeah, we live off this lake, and I'm not a lake person. I
Mm-hmm.
haven't.
Yeah, that's a really different experience.
It
I mean,
is, yeah.
especially thinking of Texas and New Mexico and just that landscape. And
Right.
lakes are very specific
I'm
sorts of
comfortable.
places to live by
Yeah,
too.
the desert in New Mexico is very comfortable to me. I grew
Mm-hmm.
up in the desert, and that feels. I recognize that place. I feel that
Mm-hmm.
place. And Oklahoma, the lushness of Oklahoma, what's what it feels like to me, even coming from Texas. And there's a
Yeah.
lot more trees up here. It just feels so much more lush, and I'm just kind of getting used to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know how to fish. I live on a lake, and I don't know how to fish. So I'm waiting. I'm waiting for Ken Hayda to come teach me how to
He'll teach
fish.
you. He
Right,
knows. He knows a thing or two about
he does. And I think
that.
once I catch a fish in Keystone Lake, I'm going to start feeling like, okay, I'm going to catch a fish, eat a fish, and that's going to start to make it feel like I belong here.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, we're still. And the other weird thing, because like you said, I still work in Texas. Like I
Mm-hmm.
drive 6 hours to teach at Tarleton State University. And so during the fall and spring, I spend, half my week down in Texas. And so I'm still kind of torn in two. I definitely
Mm-hmm.
am a divided person right now. And I look
Yeah.
forward to the day when I can just be in
Right.
Oklahoma and
Yeah,
start
I
to
think
really
you just
become
have
part of
a
this.
really unique perspective on place and home and what that means and what it means to really feel connected
Yeah.
somewhere and and you found your community, but then I think feeling a sense of home also kind of goes beyond that too. And definitely I think maybe the land and how we feel about it.
Absolutely. And
It affects
Oklahomans
that.
are there's really something special and unique about the people up here. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but they're just very, very human. They're just very
Mm-hmm.
down to earth, and
Yeah.
I'm very comfortable here, and I look forward to one day feeling like I belong here. So,
Yeah.
but
I
yeah,
think
I
they'll
think
claim you.
I hope so. I think I've spent my whole life, looking for that sense of connection because I don't really feel like I have it because of my background.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in the military, I don't have that sense of rootedness.
Mm-hmm.
And I envy that, people who do have that sense. But I've also learned that you can put down roots anywhere.
Yeah.
If you invest yourself in it enough, it can become home as well. I learned that too.
Mm-hmm.
So Japan for a while was home. I could get off the plane in Tokyo, the Tokyo airport, and I felt like this is sort of like a second home. I felt very comfortable
Mm-hmm.
there, and that's been 20 years. I haven't been back in 20 years, so I've lost that
Yeah.
connection. But for a while there, that felt like home too. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's go back a little bit, and because you mentioned your family and where you've lived, let's talk a little bit more about your parents, and maybe if you wanted to talk about life in Japan for a minute, or anything you
yeah.
might remember about grandparents if you were close to them, or if they were in your lives.
Yeah, so yeah, Dad grew up on a farm outside of Glen Rose, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
and his parents, his father died when I was, probably 6 or 7. So I have memories. We called him Grandpa. I have
Mm-hmm.
memories of him, but I didn't know him well. And then his mother, we called her Granny. She died when we were over in Japan. When I was, I think, a junior in high school. And so I wasn't even able to go to her funeral. Dad went back home for her funeral, but the rest of us were stuck in Japan. So I don't feel like I know them as well as I wish I did.
Mm-hmm.
But, Dad had like 8 brothers and sisters. And
Oh.
so, I'm trying, I try to get to know my grandparents through, my uncles and aunts and through all my cousins. We do have a strong family, sense of family. Lots of reunions and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
so I do get a sense for that. And we currently, my dad, when he retired, was eventually able to buy the family farm
Oh,
and build a
okay.
house out there. And then the old
Mm-hmm.
farmhouse where he was born still sits on the land.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've lived in that house various times. My brother and his family have lived in that house. And
Mm-hmm.
right now no one's living in it, but it's sort of this place where we've all lived at one point or another, this 100-year-old farmhouse,
Mm-hmm.
so we have that connection to it. And I have that connection to my grandparents through that land and that house. And then my mother's family was a ranch in New Mexico, a giant ranch in New Mexico. And it's giant only because you need so much land out there. There's so little water
Yeah.
that you need so much land to run, even a small herd of cattle. I think my great grandfather had about 300 animal units, of
Mm-hmm.
cattle out there, right? Which is all you could run on. I think there's something like 20 sections of land, which is just an enormous amount of space.
Yeah.
But there's very little water, so you can't run that many animals on that land. But I spent a lot of time as a child out on that ranch and the giant spaces out there of New Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and really feeling that. And I knew my mother's parents very well. They both lived until the 90s, and I got to know them as an adult and have a very strong connection. And my grandfather was a pilot, a corporate pilot for many years. And so I have some experience of flying through him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's sort of that New Mexico spirit, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I have a taste of that through them.
Mm-hmm.
So mom and dad, like I said, was career Army. Mom, raised us when we were children and then became a teacher. So she was a teacher for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both, really smart, intelligent people. And when I was a kid, everybody read books, so we always had lots of books around. And I was just like a voracious reader when I was young. I just would read anything. And I think I had asthma when I was a kid. And I think,
Oh,
when you're sickly like that and you get stuck inside a lot, you end up
yeah.
reading a lot to fill the time. At least back in those days you did, before there was all the
Mm-hmm.
things to distract us. So yes, I read constantly. And just developed a love of that over time. And so the Japan thing. So that, I was my sophomore year of high school, we moved to Japan. And like I said, my dad was at the embassy there, and I went to the American school in Japan, which
Mm-hmm.
was a private school, but it was kind of run like a public school. Like it felt
Okay.
like an American public school, but it's
Oh,
stuck in the
really?
middle of Tokyo. Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And most of the kids there, their parents, were working for a company, and they were stationed in Japan for, the parents were for IBM or Caterpillar, various corporations that did business in Japan. And this is where they sent their children to go to school. So sort of a public school / kind of private school. A lot of those kids were taking advanced courses, and they went on to
Right.
Harvard and Yale and MIT and all that kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
there was that element to it. And then there's some of us who it was so kind of like a regular high school, but we took a train an hour and a half to school every day,
Oh,
surrounded
wow.
by,
What was that like? This, and
you know,
did you learn Japanese
I took
at
2
all?
years. I took
Okay.
2 years of Japanese. It's weird, but
Mm-hmm.
it's something to do with like when your parents drag you someplace,
Mm-hmm.
like you just don't have the appreciation for it.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And because I rode the trains to school with my American friends, and I went to an American school, and I hung out with my American friends after school. Like I took 2 years of Japanese, but I never spoke. I never tried to
Really?
speak it. And I always had friends who were bilingual. I always had like these friends who had been in Japan for years, and they could always translate for us. And so I never had this, I just never tried, I never even, it didn't even really occur to me how strange it was to live in Japan for 3 years, study the language, and never speak it. See, I
Mm-hmm.
went back to Japan many years later as an
Yeah.
assistant English teacher. And we'll talk about that later. And I
Right.
met this Japanese girl at a party.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told she'd lived in England for 3 years with her parents. And then I went to talk to her, and she couldn't speak a word of English. And I was shocked, and I was like, "How could you live in England for 3 years and not learn any English?" And I was like, "Oh, wait, I know exactly how that works.
Yep.
I understand." it's just, yeah, when you're there with your parents, you just don't have the same appreciation. But it did plant a seed in me. Like, I really loved aspects of Japanese culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got my master's degree, so we're talking, this is what, 96. So, this is about 8 years later. I discovered the JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, which allowed, if you had a college degree and were a native speaker, you could be an assistant teacher in a Japanese junior high school.
Oh, that'd be an adventure.
Yeah. And I thought this sounds
group.
exactly. And I thought, I know something about Japan. I learned a little bit of Japanese. I thought this would be great. And I went back to Japan, lived in this little bitty town. No one spoke English in that town. And I realized, like, I really knew nothing about Japan. I lived there for 3 years as a kid with my parents, sort of in this American environment, and had learned nothing about Japan. And so when I went back by choice this time, and I had a couple of years there, I really invested myself in learning the language and in getting to know Japanese culture at a level that I'd never appreciated before. So there's that second time that Japan started to feel like home. The first time it was just someplace my parents were stationed and I got dragged to.
Right.
But when I went back as an adult and I invested myself, then it started to feel like home.
Yeah, having that choice, and also to acclimate to another culture, it takes effort. It's hard and uncomfortable and confusing. It can be funny and very frustrating.
And you're much smarter than me, because you realize that trying to teach at junior high is going to be really difficult. I had no idea. I went into that thinking this is going to be easy, and it wasn't. It was very, very hard. The teaching part of my life there was very challenging, very hard, and it wasn't very enjoyable.
Yeah.
So I had these 8-10 hours a day at school that I just kind of suffered through. And then I had the time outside of school and on the weekends where I really started to love Japan. But the teaching junior high kids, even in Japan, was very tough.
Yeah. I haven't taught that age group, but I've had friends who have, and no thanks.
That's kind of what I said.
I have nothing but respect for teachers who can navigate that age group and keep their sanity.
Yes, same here.
That would not be me. So you like to read a lot as a child, and you lived in so many different places, and you're around people who had all sorts of careers. What led you to English and the study of that? And was that something maybe in high school that you started thinking about, or did that kind of come later?
I really didn't. Although I think my favorite teachers from high school were my English teachers. I really liked those teachers. I was drawn to it, but I was also resisting it at some level.
Yeah.
And part of it, it was never cool to read books or to study literature. And so when I went to college, I thought you're supposed to go to college to get a degree to make money, to get a job to make money. And I thought there's no way to make money reading books. I thought this doesn't make any sense to me. And so when I went to college, I was sort of like choosing options that I thought were going to lead to great careers, and really sort of channeling, what my father wanted me to do, which, my father wished that he had been an engineer. And I sort of had that idea in my head, I would be an engineer, but I was completely unsuited to engineering. And it was actually one of my engineering advisors who suggested, he's like, the only decent grade I made my first year of college was in American Lit class. And he's like, you seem to have done pretty well in this literature class. And I said, well, I love reading, but I don't, there's no money in it. He said, don't worry about it. Do what you love and it'll work itself out. And I think he was really just like trying to get me out of his office, but it turned out to be good advice for me.
I'm glad that worked.
It did. I went and became an English major, and I still had some bumps along the way, but by and large, that was exactly what I wanted to do with my life, was read books and get to talk about them. And so I was very lucky to stumble into that, but I had no idea, growing up, that was something I could do or wanted to do. And the reading thing, I messed up my reading. This is a funny story.
Okay.
when I, 10th grade, 11th grade, somewhere in there, my dad bought this computer program, the Evelyn Wood speed reading program. My dad was like, he thought I had the potential to be one of these people that could just like sit there and read a page as fast as I could turn it. He's like, I think my son can do this.
Hmm.
And so he encouraged me to study this Evelyn Wood computer program. This is early days of the computer. This is, 85 or something. So computers are in their infancy, programs are in their infancy. So take that into account. But I did this Evelyn Wood thing, and it looked a little bit like those old typing programs. That's sort of what it felt
Hmm.
like. But all it ended up doing was it messed up my natural reading rhythm.
Oh.
Like by the time I had done, several of these courses on the Evelyn Wood, this software program, like I couldn't read anymore.
Oh no.
Like it completely messed up my reading. And so somewhere in my sophomore, junior year, I sort of quit reading naturally. And it became something that was very difficult for me to do. And I really can't explain it, but it just,
Hmm.
I was a natural reader up to that point. And after that, it became something unnatural. It's like I forgot how to breathe.
Oh
It was just
gosh.
the weirdest thing. And, I still got through books for class and I kind of stumbled through, but I'd lost my love of reading,
Hmm.
and to this day, it's still reading is sort of it's a chore for me. It's something I struggle with. I force myself to do it,
Hmm.
but it doesn't come effortlessly to me like it once did, which is weird to me. But I
Yeah.
lost that as somewhere in my adolescence, and I never really got it back. And I don't know why,
Hmm.
but it's somewhere I fell in love with the words so much, the
Hmm.
literature so much that I'll invest any amount of suffering to read it. So
Hmm.
I keep coming back to it. But yeah, I don't read like I was when I was a kid. I don't do that anymore. Isn't that
Yeah.
weird? Isn't that a funny story?
Yeah. Yeah. That is. And you teach literature.
No.
Yeah. So
Well, it helps me understand my
r-
students,
well, I was
right?
about to ask about
Yeah.
that, because it literature can be, you always have those kids in class who just love it and want to be there and like, get it.
Yeah.
And then others who just really need a leader and a guide to help them.
Yeah, and I think I can do that, because I tell them, I read as slowly as you do. I'm not a fast reader. I read very slowly, but I
Mhm.
read very carefully, and I make sure that I get everything I can out of the text when I'm reading it. And so I try to teach them how to read carefully, and that there are great rewards when you read carefully. That if you read
Mhm.
something that is beautifully written, it will reward your life tenfold. And it's worth investing your time into it. uh, and, I've dedicated my life to doing that, and so just trying to convince my students that they can do that too. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think it definitely in a strange way helps me be a better teacher. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely that empathy and understanding. So you've taught for a long time, but then you
yeah,
also worked in the international office. Is that what was that
yeah,
experience like?
and
Study abroad or something?
I continued to teach, but I was on a half. I just taught 2 classes a semester,
Mhm.
and then I worked full time in the international office. And we worked with the international students who came over here, but we also worked with the study abroad students.
Mhm.
But my boss, the director of the program, she really study abroad was kind of her thing. And so it's sort of, as I was defining what I was going to do, because she was new as a director when she hired me. And so we sort of got to define our positions. And what I loved to do was take care of the international students who came to Tarleton, who came to Stephenville, this little bitty country town, and just had no idea where they
Mhm.
had ended up. How to get a couch, how to get to the
Right.
store. There's no public transportation in Stephenville. And so just finding a way to help these students be comfortable there. And that's where that time in Japan had really came in handy.
Mhm.
I experienced terrible culture shock my second time in Japan.
Yeah.
I got there, and I felt all of this. There's a euphoria when you first get into a foreign culture. Everything is new, and you're special because you're the foreigner, and that lasts about a month. It's a very short time, and then you hit this wall, and this is where the culture shock kicks in, where you realize you don't understand anything. that everything in this culture is slightly different, and everything is slightly, it doesn't really make sense to you. And you have to find a way to sort of exist in this culture that doesn't really make sense to you. And that took months to where I finally reached a place where where I was comfortable in this new environment, in this new culture. And so I really did have an appreciation for what my international students, might be going through, and how hard it is to be away from home and away from everything you understand, and to fill the needs that they would have that they didn't even know they had sometimes. But that was a lot of fun. I really loved taking care of the international students and taking them to baseball games and taking them to Six Flags and taking them around to museums, and just really giving them a sense of what they could do. And I loved doing that. I did that for 4 years, but it was a very all-consuming kind of job. It was 12 months a year, sometimes 7 days a week, sometimes 24 hours a day, where I was trying to be there for my students. And as much as I loved it, it took a lot out of me.
Yeah.
And so I did
burnout, I'm sure.
Yeah. I was reaching that place where I was either going to burn out, or I was going to have to figure out a way to do this without investing myself so fully in it. Just figure out a way to but I sort of, at 4 years, I sort of had this idea. I always wanted to get my PhD, and I really wanted to be in the academic world. I wasn't ready to give that up. And so that's what I told my boss. I said, I'm ready to go back to full-time teaching, and I think I'm going to start working on a PhD. And I think I think that's where the direction I want my life to go. Because I guess I was there. I could have gone the international route. I could have aspired to be the director of an international program. And there was a lot about that I loved, but I was missing something too. And it's probably the books. I just wanted to get back to the books.
Sure.
So I went back to full-time teaching, and I played around with the idea of the PhD. But in all my life, I always thought I would eventually get a PhD, but I never could decide on a specialization. Like, what did I love so much? I wanted to spend the rest of my life focused on this one area. I was like, I love it all.
It's very narrow. You just have to pick one little thing, and
that's what it felt like to me. And I wasn't willing to do that. I'm like, I love it all. I'm not going to pick one thing. And that's where the MFA popped up.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, the MFA sort of, it's like, this is sort of a degree for a working poet. And as a working poet, I can be interested in everything. As a poet, the whole world is, part of what this is your material to write about, is the world itself, and everything is open. I thought that's perfect for me. And I realized that the MFA is also a terminal degree.
Right.
Although it's a master's degree, it's considered the end degree in the field of creative writing. And so it would sort of get me over that bump career-wise, because I was just a master's level instructor at Tarleton. And if I wanted my career to move at all, I needed a terminal degree, a PhD, or turns out the MFA would fill that bill as well. And so that seemed like the perfect thing. And I knew Jessica Simpson, and I knew Jason Poudrier, and I knew they were in the Red Earth MFA, and I was just hearing really wonderful things about that. And, met Janetta Calhoun-Mish, and I was like, okay, I love these people. These are the people I want to be around. And so the Red Earth just seemed like a really nice fit for me.
Right. In Oklahoma City. And also it was a low residency program. Can you explain that a little bit in case someone listening doesn't know?
Yeah. The low res means that you don't meet for regular semesters. And you don't take regular classes in that sense. You're going to meet, the way it traditionally works is you meet for a residency in the summer and another one in the winter. And that usually lasts 10 to 12 days. And those are, intensive days. You're there for 10 days straight. You're taking several workshops a day, and you're with the other students and the faculty for that time. And then during the regular semesters, you take your courses online. And so it doesn't matter where you are, or, what your day job is, as long as you have the time to get the material read and the papers written and the creative writing done, you can pretty much do it anywhere. And so that worked out perfectly. I could keep my job at Tarleton, teaching full time, and still work on this MFA. So the low res program worked out really well for what I was trying to do. And I think it tends to draw older people as well, people who do have jobs, who do have families. And can't afford the commitment of being a full-time student. And so that worked out really well. And the other people in the program were sort of my age, or, kind of sort of in a similar situation as I was. So I found a lot of camaraderie there.
Yeah.
And in the whole Oklahoma thing, we were already in love with Oklahoma, and the Red Earth in Oklahoma City just made perfect sense. So that turned out to be the right move for me.
Yeah. Well, it's a great program, and you can see, and I can just speak for what I observe here in Oklahoma, how faculty there supports their students and their graduates, and how the students also support each other. I mean, you go to a Red Earth reading or anything like that, and you can clearly see that camaraderie and in the community.
Yeah, it's so cool. And, Rob Wrench is the director of the program now.
Mm-hmm.
And he recently had an event where he got Heather Levy, Paul Uhas, and me as readers at the Literati Bookshop in Oklahoma City, all three of us were alumni. That's the word I have trouble with, alumni of the Red Earth program. And Rob decided we all had books out that we would do this reading supporting people who have graduated from the program. And I think that's so cool.
Yeah,
it's wonderful of him to think of us and to keep supporting us even after we've graduated from the program. That's kind of the Red Earth thing. And we're allowed to go back to workshops anytime we want. We sort of have this lifetime invitation to come sit in on residencies and continue to be challenged creatively. So it's really been wonderful.
Yeah, which is great, because a lot of people, and maybe I've seen this more in traditional MFA programs, they leave and then maybe you keep in touch with the friends you made there, but when you're done, you're done.
Yeah.
And a lot of people stop writing after that, because they lose the community and that support and that that gathering together and challenging each other, like in a workshop.
Yes.
So I think Red Earth's pretty special in that way, just from what from what I've seen. So you've done all of this work, you've traveled, you've had heavy teaching loads. Where did you find time to write and just cultivate your craft as a poet? Like,
great question.
When do you do that?
Right. Well, it's a constant struggle. And one of the things I love about poetry and the way I write poetry is the poems just kind of come to me. So it's not like I have to do anything in particular to, it's just sort of like I just live my life, and I feel like I have like this reservoir, and I try to fill it with as much interesting stuff as I can. And then somewhere out of that is going to come at some point, some line is going to come to my mind, and I'll write it down, and then that'll lead to another line, and then I'll just kind of follow this path till suddenly, a poem comes out of it. And the cool thing about writing poetry is you can do that anytime and anywhere. You don't know when, the muse or whatever you want to call it is going to strike. And so as long as I got something to write it down, I can write poems pretty much anytime, anywhere. If the poems are coming to me. The other problem with the way I write poetry is if the muse doesn't speak, if the poems don't come, which is the last couple of years have been a struggle. I really haven't. After I finished the MFA, and I put so much energy into that, and I guess again, to follow my analogy, the reservoir was dry,
Right.
So I'm trying to fill it up. I'm trying to find those poems again, but they really, and one of the reasons I did the MFA is I was hoping I could learn how to write poetry even when I didn't feel like writing poetry. I was hoping I would learn some trick to sort of make myself write even when the poems weren't coming to me. And I never found that trick. People do writing prompts and they do all kinds of things, and different things work for different people. But I can tell when I force a poem and when a poem just comes to me more naturally.
There's a different energy to it, and you can be a master of the craft, but if you don't have that, whatever that thing is, from within us, then it's just not going to have any power. And on the flip side, you can have something powerful to say and need help on the craft part of that. But if you've got that energy, I always like to think of it like when you read something that's just really good, that draws you in, it has to have a pulse to it. I mean, it's got to be alive somehow within you, and you know it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to
Know
me.
it when you feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes I think maybe our minds just need a break for a little while. I know
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
definitely can be like that. But let's talk a little bit about just your journey to putting this collection together.
Yeah.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
books have a story,
Yeah,
behind
really
them.
excited.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this long weird story. Like I quit writing poetry. Like I when I went to Japan after graduate school, like I'd been accepted into 2 PhD programs, one at TCU and one at North Texas,
Hmm.
and it was very hard to turn those down.
Yeah.
But at the
They're great
time,
schools.
yeah, and I'd be Dr. Jones now, and I'd have books, and I'd be some really wise, well-paid guy somewhere. I don't know. But at the time, I just sort of felt like my book learning had outstripped my life experience, and I wanted to experience the world. And so when I discovered the JET program, I thought that here's a third route. I don't have to do, or I guess the second route. I'm not going to do the PhD. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go to Japan and teach for a year or two, and then see what happens there. And what I said to myself was I was trying to find the writer inside me,
Hmm.
and I thought if I threw myself into the world, that it might spur this writing. It might, something might
Yeah.
come out of it. So I was 25, 26 at the time. And so I went to Japan, and I did write a lot, but I don't think any of it was any good. And I sort of at that stage in my life, I didn't have a writing community. I didn't know what to do with what I'd written. I didn't know how to evaluate whether it was any good. And
Hmm.
so I was just sort of writing blindly, and I just really didn't know what to do with it. But after 2 years in Japan, which was that was enough of the teaching for me, I was ready
Yeah.
to move on. And I had this buddy from Scotland, and he was finishing up too. And he's like, I want to get back to Edinburgh, Scotland, without getting on an airplane. So I'm going to go from Japan to Edinburgh, Scotland, without getting
Wow.
on an airplane. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard in my life. And he says, why don't you come with me? And I was like, why don't I come with you?
Yeah.
So I put a backpack on my back, and I traveled with my friend Colin Carroll, and he sort of, he broke me in. I think most Americans, I think we're sort of terrified of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're the most powerful nation on earth, and we're afraid of everybody.
Hmm.
At least
And
I was.
isolate,
Yeah. I was just raised with fear and this idea that everyone in the world wants to kill us or something.
Hmm.
Or everyone hates us. I don't know. I was, even though I'd gone to Japan because I'd been to Japan, I was comfortable there. But to go beyond that, to put a backpack on my back and just travel the world seemed impossible to me.
Yeah.
And here's this guy from Scotland going, yeah, it's no big deal. I'll show you the ropes. And I'm like, all right, show me the ropes. And so we did it. I traveled with Colin for like a month, and then he finally had to get back home. And I traveled for another month by myself, got all by myself in Europe.
Hmm.
And I
What
was
was
like,
that
okay,
like for you?
I can
That's
do this. It
that's
was
big.
wonderful. It was
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. And I was so good in those days. I could just show up in a town knowing nothing about the town,
Hmm.
and I could figure it out. I could figure out the place to go, to get the information I needed, to get a place to sleep, to get some food to eat, to figure out how to, I sort of go anywhere and just make myself at home. I got really comfortable as a backpacker. And so after I left Japan, I did that for about a year. I just
Hmm.
backpacked around the world, and just it was wonderful. But I eventually ran out of money. I eventually got to
Right.
a point. I ran out of money, and I was also missing home. I really hadn't
Yeah.
been home in a long time. And so I eventually came back home, but I fully intended to go travel again, to put a backpack on my back. And if I'd have known there was a word for it, like they call it vagabonding. Like
Oh, vagabonding.
yeah,
Okay.
if I had known that's
Yeah.
what I was doing, I would have kept doing it, I think. But I didn't know what I was doing. And I hit 30. I hit that 30th birthday.
Hmm.
And people would ask me, what do you do for a living? I'm like, oh my God, I don't do anything.
An explorer.
Yeah, I know.
Adventurer.
I was a vagabond / writer. That's what I was trying to be, but I didn't know
Yeah.
it. So I sort of lost faith in, not faith in myself, but I just got a little scared. I thought, at
Sure.
30, you're supposed to have a job, you're supposed to have a
Hmm.
family, and sort of that the way society
Yes.
trains you to think you're supposed to be, that really kicked in at 30. And I was like, man, I got to settle down. And about that time, my old university, Tarleton State, and one of my professors got hold of me, and they're like, there's a job here. Someone just quit and left us shorthanded. And if you can get back here, I can give you a full-time job. And I'm like, man, that's a really great offer. And I can't really say no to it because I need a job.
Right.
So I went to Tarleton, and that was supposed to be for a year. I was going to work there for a year, and then I was going to go travel some more. I was going to go be the vagabond again. And what happened that first year at Tarleton, this is fall 2000, is I met Julie Chappell. Right. And Julie Chappell and I fell in love. Yeah. And the next thing I knew, I was applying for a full-time job at Tarleton the next year. And then the next thing I know, 21 years later, I'm still teaching at Tarleton.
Yeah.
What happened there? My vagabonding got sidetracked a little bit.
Love's pretty powerful.
It is. Well, Julie, I met
the
Julie.
Right person.
Yeah, she offered me, another way to live in the world. With a partner, and she had kids, sort of with a family, and sort of in a way that I had rejected and thought I didn't want, and I was like, well, what do I know? Maybe I do want that. Maybe I need to give that a try. Maybe being this lonely guy with a backpack on traveling the world, maybe there's more to life than that.
Yeah.
And I decided to give it a try, and I don't have any regrets. I do sort of miss those vagabonding days, but they were a little bit lonely too. And I didn't write anything back then that I thought was worth a darn. So I sort of gave up writing, and so I met Julie. I threw myself into teaching, and I basically just decided I'm 30 years old. Give up childish things. I'm not a poet. If I were a poet, I would have published something by now. So maybe I'm not a poet. So I just quit writing for like 10 years.
Oh, really?
I quit writing. Yeah, I didn't write at all. At first, I kept kind of journal entries. I'd jot things down, but I just didn't think any of it was any good, and I just quit. And I was okay because I loved my job, and I loved being with Julie, and I had plenty to keep me occupied. And it was Julie's fault that I got back into poetry.
Yeah, because you finished your MFA in 2019, right? So that's pretty recent.
20 years later, right?
Yeah, to have to put all of this together.
Yeah, well, so what Julie did is she started dragging me to these conferences and writing festivals. Like she started writing poetry again. She hadn't written in a long time. She started writing again. And she would drag me to these things, and I would have to pay my own way because I wasn't presenting. So in 2010, I'm like, the heck with this. I had this old poems I wrote back when I was in Japan. I got this old poetry, and I submitted it to a conference, and they accepted it. It's like, so the first time in my life, I got my conference paid for. Julie dragged me to this conference, but I got the conference paid, where the university paid for my trip because I was presenting, my poetry, and I was like, this is a pretty good gig. And so I did that a couple of times, but then I ran out of poetry. I was like, I got no more poetry to write.
You ran out.
I ran out and nothing. But I'd met all these wonderful people by then. I knew Hardy Jones and Ken Hayda. I think we'd met Dorothy Alexander, Abigail Keegan. We just met Ben Myers. We met these wonderful people. And like Dorothy Alexander and Devi invited us to stay at their house in Oklahoma City. I'm still like, I'm not a poet. I remember talking to Nathan Brown one time, and he's like, is it hard to be the spouse, being dragged to these writing events and not being a writer? He asked me that question, and I was like, no, I guess it's not that hard, I guess, but it made me kind of sad, I guess, because I'm not a writer,
Right.
And so in 2013, we're at Dorothy and Devi's house, and this line of poetry popped in my head. I'm not sure it was a particularly good line of poetry. What does a butterfly do in a storm? I think it was something like that. But I had this line, and it was like almost perfect iambic pentameter. And I was like, holy crap, that's a line of poetry. I said, this is very interesting. This is on the back porch of Dorothy and Devi's house. And I go, And then we went home, and I'm mowing the lawn, and I take a break from mowing the lawn, and I just sat down, and I got my iPhone out, and I got the notes out, and I just started writing. And it was about riding my bike to school that morning and some things that I'd seen, and it all came out. I said, well, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
I sent it to Julie, and she's like, well, that's pretty good. Where'd that come from? I said, I don't know. Hanging out with these Oklahoma poets,
Yeah.
And then I read Alan Barreca's book, The Comic Flaw. I'd met him, and he'd give me a copy of his book. I read that before spring break that year. And that book just fired me up. After reading Alan Barreca's poetry, I just wrote poetry for the whole spring break.
Mm-hmm.
Like nothing, but none of it was any good, but I was just writing like a madman.
Yeah.
And then I just kept doing that. And then at some point I finally wrote, like the first poem I knew was a really good poem. I wrote Close Kin.
Mm-hmm.
I was getting ready to go to this jazz concert Saturday, and I had about 30 minutes before I had to get in the car to go. And I'd been chopping down trees with my brother and my dad, and I just had this idea in my head, and I sit down and I wrote it down. I was like, oh my gosh, that's a good poem. I didn't need anyone to tell me that was a good poem. I was like, that's a good poem.
Mm-hmm.
Or it didn't matter if no one else liked it. I was like, I think that's a good poem.
Right.
And that was like that was the first poem of this book. That's like
Mm-hmm.
2013 that sort of came. And then I wrote a lot of stuff in those years, but it's a real mixed bag. And I reached this kind of plateau, and I was like, I don't know where to go next with this.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the MFA sort of presented itself. It's like maybe the MFA, I need a little more training. I need a little more like I need just a sense of what it means to be a poet in the world. I just
Mm-hmm.
needed something, and I thought the MFA would provide that for me. And so I did the 2 years of MFA, wrote a thesis for that. Tim Bradford was my mentor, worked very closely with Tim and with Janetta and with some of the other great faculty. And I produced this thesis I was very proud of. But I knew that the thesis wasn't the book of poetry. It was very much, a student's thesis.
Yeah.
And the first time I submitted the manuscript, I sent it to a publisher, and I just basically sent my thesis. And it was I think it's that student mistake, that rookie mistake, where you just like, I just sent everything because I put so much of myself in it. I thought it must all be worth reading.
Yes.
And the first publisher came back and they're like, there's some good stuff in here, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to be worked out. And I was like, oh, and that was very depressing to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized they were right. And so I spent another year, working on this manuscript and whittling it down to just the poems that I felt were really my best poems. These are really great poems. And I got it down to this manuscript. I thought this feels like a good manuscript. And I sent this to Paul Bowers at Turning Cloud Press. Man, he got back to me within 24 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, he's like, I want to publish this book. He made some suggestions. We made a few changes, but he was like, he loved the book. And I thought, this is the perfect publisher. Someone who loves your work and wants you to get the book that you want out of it.
They have to champion you.
And Paul Bowers has done that. Yeah. And so that's where this book came from. It's a long, circuitous journey to kind of get to this final book. And it's wonderful to get here. But like we've already talked about, I can't write anymore. But maybe the book came out in March, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe now that the book's out there, once I sort of get the book out of my system, maybe it's time to start writing some more.
Yeah. Sometimes we just need to pause for a minute, or just get out into the world and read what you've already worked on. And, now that the world's opened up again and we can meet in person, and I think you've still done some Zoom readings too, but, just being out there in the community,
yes,
I think
that's where my poetry,
energizing.
Yeah, it's where my poetry started, was just on the back porch of Dorothy and Debbie's house, being around poets, enjoying that feeling. And that's where the poetry came from. And I think you're exactly right. I need more of that. So
yeah.
And
so Close to Kin, I've read that. I've heard you read it as well. And we were talking before the interview, just about it. In a first collection of poetry, it can be pretty eclectic, but then there's certain themes that really come through. And that one, would you say that's about masculinity and fatherhood, or what?
Absolutely.
What do you think is most striking about that poem to you? Because you knew it when it came to you. You knew that this it had that power we were talking about.
Yeah, and that poem in particular is about that family feeling, and it's with my father and my brother, and it's sort of, in what to me, that in that poem, what I'm saying in that poem is, I have my father and I are very different. My brother and I are very different people, and politically, diametrically opposed.
Mhm.
And my father never really understood my love of books, although he respected books. He never had that love of books, and he never really understood, staying inside for 10 hours to read a book. That doesn't make sense to him, never made
Mhm.
sense to him. And so it was always kind of hard to, I think a lot of writers, you feel like the stranger in your family.
Mhm.
There's a Texas writer, R.C. Vliet, I think his name is, who wrote an essay one time that made perfect sense to me. And he said that the writer is the rattlesnake egg in the bird's nest.
Mm.
And
Oh,
that's
I like that.
kind of what I felt like.
Yeah.
Your parents raise you and then you turn into this creature that could kill them, and it's like, what is this thing we've raised?
Mhm.
And I'm like, Mom, Dad, it's me. Rattle, 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 And we're just like, we're not too sure about it. I don't know. That made perfect sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
And I feel that disconnect sometimes from my family. But when we work together
Mhm.
and we don't talk much, and it's just physical labor and we're all doing what we know how to do and we're good at it, and we're accomplishing something together, I feel this closeness with them that I don't feel otherwise.
Mhm.
It's very difficult to find, when we're sitting there talking to each other and we're not really communicating very well, and it's just this struggle to connect with the people you love. But for some reason, when we work together, that was always a time that I felt like I connected with them.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what that poem's about for me.
Yeah.
And also sort of that the twist at the end, the turn at the end is, when we've cut down this scissor limb of this tree and we've deformed the tree, and we
Mhm.
accomplished what we wanted was to protect the farmhouse, but we also made what was beautiful ugly. And I'm sort of like looking at that going, maybe we should not have done that,
Mhm.
but while I was working with my father and my brother, I didn't think about that. We just did what we came there to do. And I enjoyed that time with them very much. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's just trying to find that connection
Mhm.
with my family, with my father and my brother, that sometimes is so hard to find.
Yeah, or just talking about that feeling
Yeah.
of otherness a little bit, the rattlesnake example that you gave. I think the Too Late for Manly Hands kind of
Mm,
addresses that
it does.
as well.
Yes.
You're supposed to
Yeah.
have calloused hands, and
Right.
instead
You've got these soft hands of a writer.
you're just this life of the mind, and that's a
Yes.
different kind of work.
I remember one of my great aunts, my granddad's sister, and she was a scientist.
Mhm.
She was a very high scientist back in the 50s when that was unusual. She's a very smart woman and never got married. But she said she was always disappointed when she met, scientists who were men,
Mm.
because she would shake hands with them and they always had soft hands.
Oh.
And she always thought that this is, a real man shouldn't have soft hands. And
Mm.
even though she knew better, and even though she
Mhm.
was a scientist in a community of scientists, it just put her off. It's like, these are not real men. And I think I struggle with that too, that,
Yeah.
what does it mean to be a real man? And sitting inside reading and writing doesn't quite feel like the right kind of work. That's not the way I was raised.
Mhm.
That just doesn't quite sit right. And yet at some level, I know that's the only way that we are going to accomplish if we're going to accomplish anything meaningful on this earth, it's
Mhm.
going to be through words.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, which have a purpose and they endure.
yeah.
I mean,
I, t-
just like,
I
I
told
mean,
Julie this
it's
morning,
written down, just like
yeah,
this interview.
yeah.
We
I told Julie
gotcha.
this morning, she's like, yeah, I got up at like 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
She knew I left the bedroom early and I was out here.
Yeah.
And she's like, what did you do? And I was like, well, I didn't really do anything productive. And she's like, what did you do? And I was just writing. And I was like, well, I still feel that way, right? After I'm 51 years old and I published a
Mhm.
book and I've got my MFA and I still spent 3 hours writing this morning. And when Julie
Mhm.
asked me and I said I didn't do anything productive, I can't get that, I'm trying to get past that mindset.
Yeah, it's a hard
Not
one, but
feel guilty.
it's a practice, which I've heard it described like that. And I practice yoga, so maybe this is where this is coming. I know this is where this idea is coming from, but just the idea that you sit down to your practice, what happens happens. Maybe your body cooperates with you, maybe it doesn't. maybe it's great, maybe it's a horrible session.
Yeah.
And then you do it again the next day and you have what you did before, but all we can start with is now.
Yeah.
And I think writing's like that. It can be even you can love it and it can still be a slog and hard and feel horrible.
And you have to convince yourself it's still worth doing, right?
Yeah, and that it's just all garbage. I mean, I'm kind of talking about myself right now and like this chapbook that maybe I'll never finish, or I will, but it's just hard.
Yeah, the best advice I've run across recently, William Stafford was talking to a bunch of students and they were like asking, what do you do about writer's block? And he's like, I don't really acknowledge that such a thing exists, but if you do feel like you have writer's block, he says, lower your standards and keep writing. If you're a writer, writer, keep writing. And I was like, lower your standards and keep writing. Because I think that's part of my problem finishing the MFA and studying, because we intensely studied very fine poets. The whole time I was doing the MFA, we're constantly reading books of poetry and studying what makes poetry great, and kind of getting to the end of it feeling like, wow, my poetry just does not stand up with the great poetry. It's not great poetry. And I say, well, lower your standards and write anyway, because it's a mental block I've created for myself. I write something, well, that's just crap. That's not any good. You say, well, if you're a writer, then you write it out. You keep writing. And that's Richard Bausch is the one. He was a wonderful writer, and I follow him on Facebook. He's absolutely worth following. He posts this writing advice. It's just wonderful. And he's the one that posted the story about William Stafford, and he also posted he's constantly kind of reminding us, is like that it's a great gift to be able to write and enjoy that gift, that you've been given a gift where you can write, you can write something that's worth reading. And you can spend your days trying to make it better. And they said it's really wonderful that you get a chance to do that. And so just embrace that. It's true. And even if the only one who ever likes it is Julie,
well, she's got really good taste, so I'd take that.
I think she does.
She knows what she's talking about.
Yeah. But just enjoy the fact that we can do this. We know. Someone put it in our heads that we can actually put words together in a way that will please other people. And we can just be a small part of that. And that's kind of cool. I'm happy to be part of that.
Yeah. Because and now I'm thinking about one of the other themes I had mentioned, which is love and your relationship with your wife, and some of the things that you wrote about that were really hard, which she's written about her experiences with cancer too, which we did talk about in our interview, but you had your view from it. Which is, I mean, how unique is that to have two writers processing something that, a lot of other people out there have experienced, and sometimes it's very comforting to just see that someone else understands what it's like.
And that was, so 2016 was her second round of cancer. She had a cancer the first time in 2005, and we got through that, but I wasn't writing back then. So that was interesting. So the second time I was writing. But what happened is I found it, that was kind of the first time that the writing dried up for me. So that was 2016. And for the year after that, I felt like I took a semester off to take Julie to her chemo treatment. So I wasn't teaching at all for a semester, and I wasn't doing the MFA yet. So I really had just endless amounts of time on my hands, other than taking care of Julie. But what I felt like I was in prison. To the degree that I understand what that really means. But I just felt like this must be what it's like to be in prison, where you have nothing but time on your hands, but you can't do anything with that time. Because your soul's being crushed. Like I couldn't do anything with it. I could hardly read, and everything felt just false to me, and I could not. I'm sad. I wish I could have written about the whole experience, but I really felt that I absolutely could not. A few poems here and there, and some of those made it into the book. But by and large, it was a really hard time to endure.
It's a consuming
It really was.
time. I mean,
Yeah.
it takes everything.
Yeah. It
Sure.
really did. It really did. And it was the 2017. That was so Julie had finished chemo and she was into radiation, which means we
Mm-hmm.
were on the downward slope. It was just
Yeah, right.
radiation. And at the end of that, she was going to be cancer free. So we were very hopeful at that point. She'd survived the chemo, the really difficult chemotherapy.
Yeah.
But that was when I got into the MFA program. It was that January that I
Oh,
went to my
wow.
first residency. Her son and daughter came to stay with her while I was gone. And then I taught part-time that semester and then started the MFA. And it was really kind of a wonderful experience in a weird kind of way, because
Mm-hmm.
I found I couldn't sleep a lot of the time. I'd be up all night just
Yeah.
catching sleep in waves. But it was perfect for it because now I had to focus. The MFA gave me some focus. It was like,
Yeah.
Janetta gave me the list of books to read this, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
read this, and that would kind of get me through the night. And then
Yeah.
it'd get me inspired to write some things. And so that was really kind of a fascinating way to start it.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of just finished it going back to full-time teaching and getting through that. And that was a hardship of its own to teach
Yes,
full-time, which is a very consuming kind of job,
absolutely.
and try to take a full-time MFA at the same time.
Yeah.
But after surviving cancer,
Mm-hmm.
everything else felt, this is doable. We can get through this now.
Yeah.
So
Kind of put
yeah,
things in perspective,
it
I
did.
think.
It really did. And Julie, she's just she's a constant inspiration. She's a brilliant academic. She's a
Mm-hmm.
creative writer. She's a wonderful poet. She's a short story writer. And it's wonderful to have that presence. And like
Mm-hmm.
I said, it was her dragging me to writing festivals and
Yeah.
conferences that got me to start writing again too. It was the friendship
Mm-hmm.
she made and brought me
Mm-hmm.
with her that sort of brought me out of my shell and got me to write again too. So
Yeah. Just that mutual
yeah,
support
yeah,
too, which I think for any person who is creative, especially if there's two creatives in a relationship, that can be kind of tricky to
yeah.
navigate, especially if you're both interested in the same kinds of writing. It can be competitive, um, from what I've observed
I think
at
it is. I
times.
think it is a little bit. Although
Yeah.
I'm not really competitive by nature.
Hmm.
Because if I were, Julie's grinding me into the dust. I've published one book of poetry. It took me years to get it done. Basically 7 years from the first poem I wrote to getting it published. And in that time, she's published 2 books of poetry, a book of short stories, an academic collection. She's just constantly putting stuff out there. Um, but I'm just happy for her, and it
Hmm.
keeps her occupied and interested and sharp and focused, and
Yeah.
I love that. And I try to borrow a little of that energy for myself. I'm much
Hmm.
slower. She's the hare, and I'm the tortoise.
Hmm.
She's just zoom, 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 and I'm just kind of plodding along. But
Yeah.
I eventually get there, but it's going to take me a lot longer and be
Yeah.
a little more deliberate in the process.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're both going to get there, but we just take a
Yeah.
little slightly different route, and you kind of balance each other out. Her
Yeah, I
high
was about to
energy,
say, yeah, that
yeah,
there's the balance and then a generosity, between
yeah,
each other to give you the space you might need or encouragement. And then,
exactly,
that works the same way.
exactly, yeah, and understand that sometimes you just need to spend hours, focused on working on your writing. It is hard to find people who understand that,
Hmm.
but we do, and it's
Yeah.
fun when she's like really focused on a book and working. Because then I basically have like all this free time. I'm like, oh, okay. She's
Yeah.
so focused on
It's
working. I'm
its
like, oh,
own,
I could do,
once you
yeah,
there's a
yeah,
flow to it that, you can't interrupt someone who gets into that
yeah.
space. I think it's something that only another writer could understand what that person would need,
I think so.
you
And I
know?
don't really understand how she does it. I mean, she
Uh-huh.
really is sort of a force of nature. I don't really
Yeah.
understand it because she's over
Hmm.
here writing books and I'm over there, pulling some random book off the bookshelf and
Hmm.
spending, getting lost in it. And I'm like, what'd you do today? Oh, I just read a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I wrote a little bit here, a little bit there, but really nothing. I just didn't
That's
really get
funny.
much done. But it sort of works out. It sort of balances somehow. Yeah. So.
Yeah. What do you think you've learned about yourself as a poet over these last few years?
That's a good question. I feel like I still don't fully understand poetry, but that's part of why I love it. That's part of why I keep coming back to it, because I'm it's a constant challenge. It's why I teach. I teach because I hate getting up in front of people and acting like I know what I'm talking about. That's like the most terrifying thing in the world, and yet like it's never boring. It's never rote. I mean, I'm constantly terrified and I'm challenged, and I have to get up there and do the best that I can do. And sometimes I do wonderful things, and sometimes I crash and burn. I pick myself up and I go back and I do it again. And I think the poetry is sort of that same feeling. I keep striving to write something worth reading, and I fail a lot of the time, but sometimes it really does come together and something kind of amazing happens. And I think, well, I'd like to do a little bit more of that. What have I learned? I think I'm still learning. I don't know when that day will come when I will introduce myself as a poet. I don't know. I'm still hesitant. I do, but I'm still hesitant.
Yeah.
And I'm very much that kind of person that I'll put the book down before you can. I'll be like, oh, that book's not anything worth reading. I'll say things about the book because that sort of disarms you. If you're going to have a negative reaction to my poetry, I'd rather get there first. Say, well, I know it's all crap. I know it's not very good. And like, I can have 100 people tell me it's wonderful and one person tell me it's crap, and I believe the person who tells me it's crap.
Yeah, I think our brains are kind of wired like that.
I think so. So I'm still struggling. But this book helps a lot. It's something I can look at on the bookshelf. Paul Bowers believed in me, and people who have had some great reactions to it, and that does help me believe a little more of myself. Hopefully that reservoir is filling up again, and I'm going to start tapping into it again and writing again. So
we've talked a little bit about your creative process, but is there anything more you want to add to that, or maybe even say, I'm sure any creative writing student will ask this, how do you know when it's done? When's it ready?
That's a great question. And the poems are tough because
they really are.
Paul Bowers got after me about this, and he's not the first, but he's like, I'm always trying to, me personally, he says that, Hank, you try to close the door in a poem. And he says that's fine for a short story, closing the door at the end, but in a short story, you really want to leave it more open. You want to leave a crack in the door for your reader. And so he would often encourage me to sort of take off the last line or the last couple lines of a poem.
Yeah.
Rather than, because I had sort of this instinct where I want to sort of wrap it up and tell you what to think about it. And he's like, don't do that. Sort of leave the poem a little more open and let your reader come to that conclusion. So that was something I have to struggle with, because I go through that process of the poem. By the end, part of what I do at the end is I'm like, oh, this is what the poem means. I'm coming to that conclusion myself.
Yeah.
So when I'm writing that for me, but Paul's like, you don't have to put that there, man. You can't. You leave that part off. So that was helpful advice. It's not always the case. It's poem to poem. It's a little bit different. But one weird thing that I do as a poet, I think that maybe makes me unusual, and I'm not proud of it, but I write everything. I write everything on my iPhone.
That's okay.
And I would prefer to be, the poet with the pad of, in his pocket and a pen or pencil and a whoop it out and write down things by hand, or have the journal. And I've tried that. And I think 20 years of grading freshman papers has made me hate writing. By hand. I don't like writing by hand. My hand, it hurts. I start to write with a pen or pencil, and I feel like I'm grading again, and it's just like I don't want to be there. That's a bad space for me. So I don't enjoy writing by hand, even though I love the idea of it, and I love and I understand why people do it, but for me, it's the stupid iPhone. I have my notes there, and I can type really fast with my thumbs.
Yeah. Well, and you
on
got to be
that little
comfortable
keyboard.
too. And then on a cloud, you can't lose it. I used to be a pencil and paper writer, and I found that it's a really bad idea for me. I mean, I've got a little kid, and my house, I feel like, is always kind of disarray when you have a little 7-year-old whirlwind living with you. Like, for defense, I gotta put it on my phone, like on a Google Doc.
Well, and the beauty of that,
or else I will lose it.
Right. And the beauty of that, like you said, it's I don't have to, because that's another thing I hate is if you write it by hand, then you have to type it in.
And then you have to type. I hate typing. I like writing it down, but I really hate typing it.
Yeah.
I've got all kinds of poems for this book I'm working on that I just had to write it down. And now I've got to find all of them. And
yeah. I feel the same way.
And they're everywhere. These little notebooks. I'm like, these darn notebooks. What was I thinking?
Yeah. And when I'm typing from reading and typing from something, I get this ache between my shoulder blades that just, I hate this ache. And it eventually gets up into my head and gives me a headache.
Yeah.
And so I hate typing like that. And so, so the phone actually is the easiest for me to get my thoughts onto paper without any interruption, without, of course, the autocorrect likes to get there and mess with my flow sometimes.
It can, it can be funny.
And it can also sort of sometimes open up an interesting direction you didn't see coming. So, that's how I do most of my writing. And since I've always had my phone with me, then I always have something I can capture my ideas on. So
no excuse to not do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's harder to procrastinate when you're like, well, I don't have my notebook. It's not quiet enough. I'm not in this space or that space.
Exactly. I can write anytime, any place, pull over on the side of the road if I'm driving, and I can capture an idea. And that's very, very lovely to have that ability to do that. So,
So
other thing I'd say to young writers is
that was my next question. What about some advice?
Yeah, the other thing I'd say, just read constantly. You just gotta read as much as you can.
Yeah, and carefully. It's okay to think about it.
Yeah, you're joining in a tradition of using language artistically, and you have to appreciate that tradition if you're going to add anything meaningful to it. So you got to read all the time, but you also have to get out there and have life experience.
Yeah,
that's the other thing. You can't lock yourself away and ever expect, I think, anything really interesting to come out of that. You have to be out in the world, and it's the unexpected things that happen in the world. The thing I was writing about this morning. I went home for the weekend, for the 4th of July weekend, to be with my mother and brother. Lost my father in March. And I was just, checking on my mother and making sure everything was okay and spending the 4th of July with him, which was a big deal for, my dad and brother are both part of the American Legion. They do a pancake breakfast and they do the parade. And so I just sort of wanted to be there. My dad was a big part of that. He's not there now. So I wanted to be part of that. And so I'm down there, and we had the parade on Saturday. And then my brother invited the Legionnaires over to his house later that day. And these are a lot of, very conservative Republican type people. And I'm not, and so I was getting along with them just fine. As long as we didn't talk politics, we were getting along great. But I knew the longer we were hung out and the more, my brother was serving his homemade rum. I thought the more we drink this,
that is danger.
This could get ugly. But one of the Legionnaires was a mother who had a young child, this 11-year-old boy. And he was going to get the chance to swim in my brother's pool. And it was overcast and there was a fear of lightning. And so the mother was like, absolutely not. You're not swimming. And so the boy was just despondent. He was crying in a corner, and he was the only child there. So the rest of them was these adults talking about, stuff. And so I went to check on him, and I'm like, what's going on? And he's told me his story. And I was like, the pool's not the only thing. There's also a mountain behind us we can climb. If you want to go climb that mountain, that's not as good as swimming, but I think it's second best. And I finally got him interested enough that he and I climbed to the top of the mountain, and I ended up playing with this kid for like 4 hours. And every once in a while I'd hear these snatches of conversation from the adults, talking about conspiracy theories and all this stuff. And I was
got out just in time.
Thank God I don't have to be in there. And I'm just having fun with this kid, you know? And so this morning I was trying to capture that. I was trying to write about that experience. And I never saw that coming. I didn't know I was going to spend half a day playing with an 11-year-old who would say really deep things like, life is meant to be lived, and I'm just wasting my time if I can't swim. And I'm just like, what? That's a bit deep, kid.
Little kids will do that.
I know. He was just laying this stuff on me, and I was like, okay, kid, you're deep, but I got to get you out of your head for a bit, So so that was like this unexpected thing. But you got to be out there. You got to be in the world doing things to run into those sorts of encounters. You just never know what's going to spark a writing experience, So so read a lot and live a lot. Those are the two things.
Read a lot and live a lot. Yeah, right. I like that. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't cover?
I think that felt like a really, I think your questions were wonderful, and gave me a chance to talk about lots of things that are very important to me. I feel like we covered it. I feel like,
okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you, Hank.
Well, and I appreciate the affirmation that you asking me to be to interview for this project you're doing. Suggests that you believe I'm a real writer, and I really appreciate. Paul Bowers being willing to publish my book shows his faith in my
interviewed
ability.
him too. I've got the whole community. Yeah,
yes, I'm grateful for being part of it, and thank you for including me.
This is great. Thank you.
It was. It really was. So.